Chapter 3 Dreams. As she moved the stew off the fire, she heard an assortment of sounds from one of the other rooms. She grinned. Newmer had a habit of talking aloud as he fixed information of interest in his memory. Walking to an open door, she looked inside. Bent half double, the maid stood at the window as he tried to shave, using a mirror propped on the sill. That's the trouble with being so tall, she thought, not for the first time. The things most folk can make use of, like windowsills, are that much farther away from him. When he took the razor from his skin, she asked, "Need help?" His dark eyes lit in welcome. "It's good to see you on your feet." "It's good to be on them." Getting the mirror, she held it for him. "Have you talked to Da or Ma about sending us home?" He smiled crookedly and wet his razor again. "Let us say rather that I have attempted to do so. They are amazingly elusive on the subject. The best I've gotten so far is that we may discuss it once you have recovered." "I've recovered," she assured him. She knew that wasn't entirely true, but the images she had seen in the sunbird's display worried her. "Dane," he said, then stopped. She waited. Something was troubling him. She could hear it in his voice. Perhaps you should stay here when I return. This is your home. You'd be safe here." She put down the mirror, outraged. "How can you say that? Tortle is my home." "You'd be with Syrah. I know you've missed her. You'd get to know your father." He put the mirror back on the sill and scraped the remaining bristles from his chin. "Look at it from my perspective." He wouldn't meet her eyes, but his soft voice was pleading. "I was powerless against the Skinners. There are so many foes in this war, and too many are strange. I would like to know that you, at least, had a chance to survive." "I'll make my own chances, if you please." Standing, she fought sudden dizziness. Carefully, she sat on the bed as Newmer rinsed and dried his face. "Will you at least consider it?" he asked, draping the towel over the window ledge. "No." Dane. Picking up the mirror, he examined his face. His dark brows twitched together. He shoved the mirror under her nose. "What do you see?" Instead of her reflection, the glass showed battle. Sir Raoul of the King's Own, Bury of the Queen's Riders, and a mixed company of the Own and Riders fought in a temple square. Ranged against them were Carthage warriors in crimson leather. Overhead, creatures swooped down to attack the Tortolans with long-handled axes. Dane gasped. These were some kind of bat-winged flying apes, their long black fur streaked with gray. The image vanished. Newmer put the mirror down with fingers that shook. Quietly, the girl described what she had seen in the sunbird's dazzling flight. "In the divine realms we observe mortal affairs," said Broadfoot, waddling into the room. "Liquid is the most reliable, but flame and mirrors work. Mortals who visit tell us that in their sleeping just before they wake, they hear what is said as well." "Is it possible to observe specific people and events?" inquired Newmer. "Yes," replied the Duckmole. "It is how Syrah could observe you, Dane. With practice you could master it in a week or so, and hear as well as see what goes on in the mortal realms." Newmer picked up the mirror and sat on the bed. "We'll finish our chat later," Dane told him, standing. "I'm not done with you." He was not listening. With a sigh, she left him, trying not to use the furniture for support. The animal god followed her into her room. "Are you well?" "Just tired is all." Sitting on the bed, she rubbed her face. "Maybe climbing that bluff wasn't the cleverest thing to do on my first day out of bed." The Duckmole vanished from the floor, reappearing beside her on the coverlet. Careful not to bump him, Dane lay back. "Of all times for him to go protective on me. Maybe he ate something that was bad for him." She closed her eyes. "Maybe he loves you," Broadfoot said. She didn't hear. She was already asleep. In her dream, a pale wolf approached. Instead of the plumed tail that her kind bore proudly, this wolf's tail was thin and whip-like. "Rat-tail!" Dane ran to meet the chief female of the pack that helped to avenge Syrah's murder. It didn't seem to matter that Rat-tail was dead, or that a nasty female named Frostfur had taken her place in the pack. When she was close, the wolf turned and trotted away. "Wait!" Dane shouted, and followed. Rat-tail led her down a long dark hall, stopping at a closed door. When the girl caught up, the wolf held her paw to her muzzle, as if to say, "Hush." Dane knelt and pressed her ear to the door. "Ganiel, Usay's power worries you too much." While Dane had never heard that booming voice before, she knew that the speaker was Mithros the Sun Lord, chief of the gods. "We have always contained her. She has not the power to break through the barrier between her and us." "If she's got no power, how is she holding her own against you for the first time in 1,000 years? Dane stifled a gasp. That was Karthik's patron, the graveyard hag. "She's using tricks we've never seen before, and I don't like it. You're fighting her the way you always have. What if she's found a new way to overset us? A way that we've never encountered and don't know how to defeat?" "She will not consume us," Mithros said flatly. "She cannot fight us all, and she has no allies in any realm but her own." The dream faded as Dane opened her eyes. She was still tired. Her legs and back felt limp. Her nose worked as well as ever, though. She breathed deeply, enjoying the flood of good smells in the air. One was stew, the other bread. She was hungry. Her dress should have been wrinkled from her nap, but when she flapped her skirts, the creases vanished. Quickly she splashed water on her face and combed her hair, then went outside, hearing voices from the garden. There was a bit of sunlight left, but globes of witchfire hung over the table, growing brighter as night fell. 3 men stood when she arrived. Sirrah, Broadfoot, Queenclaw, and the Badger nodded to her. We were ingested to the new male. "Daughter, this is Ganiel, Master of Dream, and one of the great gods. Ganiel, my daughter, Verla Dane." The girl looked up into a pale face framed by an unruly mane of dark hair. The eyes were shadowy pits that stretched into infinity. Staring into them, she thought that she saw the movement of stars in the distance. Or was it Rat-tail? Cold hands shook hers, jolting her back to the present. The god brushed Dane's fingers with a polite kiss. "He says it is a pleasure to meet you," Weirin told her. "You must excuse him. As a Dream King, he's only permitted to speak to mortals in dreams. We gods hear him." Weirin tapped his skull. "But you won't." Dane curtsied to the god. "I'm honored, your majesty." Ganiel smiled and took a seat at Sirrah's right. Numer was at Weirin's left. A place had been left for Dane between the mage and the duck-mole. She stumbled trying to climb over the bench. Numer caught her and braced her arm until she was seated. As utensils clattered and plates were handed around, there was no way to avoid noticing that the company included a duck-beaver creature, a man crowned with antlers, and a lanky, pallid man who seemed to fade into the growing shadows, even while his face shone under witch lights. More than anything Dane had observed since she and Numer were yanked out of that orchard, that dinner table said that Sirrah Beneskri was not the Moss she had lived with in Gala. The animal gods, her parents, and Ganiel spoke mind to mind. She could see it in the way they turned their heads, moved their hands, or leaned forward. Dane concentrated on her food. She was fascinated by the variety. She hadn't seen a cow, a wheat field, or a grape arbor, but there was wine, bread, and cheese as well as the hare. Even knowing that the hare god lived on in a fresh body, she couldn't bring herself to have its meat. When the wine pitcher came to her, she passed it to Numer without pouring any for herself. If the food and water of the divine realms made her senses reel, she didn't want to think what liquor might do. Numer asked Weirin a question, keeping his voice low. "Petition the great gods for all the good it will do." Weirin's reply could be heard by all. "They are too busy fighting Usei to ferry mortals back home. They won't even reply to mind calls from us lesser gods." Numer looked at Ganiel. "Forgive me," he said, "but our friends are hard-pressed. Might you send us home? You are one of the great gods, and you don't look as if you were locked in combat with the Queen of Chaos." Ganiel smiled, shadowed eyes flickering, and shook his head. "He says you forget your myths," Sirrah told them. "Of the great gods, the Dream King alone cannot enter the mortal realms. He can only send his creatures to do his work there." "Forgive me," Numer said politely. "I had forgotten." On Dane's foot, caught in a beam of light that fell between her and Numer, something moved. Reshaping her eyes to those of a cat, she looked harder. An inky shadow had thrown a tentacle over her bare foot. Was it the Darking that Weirin had shot? "Pass the cheese?" asked Broadfoot, nudging her with his head. She obliged, forking slices onto his plate. As the duck-mole happily mashed cheese in his bill, she glanced at her companions. Queenclaw mildly batted a piece of bread to and fro. Her mother seemed to be conversing with Ganiel, while Numer tried to learn from Weirin if a human mage might have better luck in approaching the rulers of the divine realms. "I don't see why you fuss about it so," Weirin snapped. "Come the fall equinox, you at least will be dragged back to your wars, and I wish you the joy of them." "They don't give me joy, and I didn't ask for them," Numer said, voice tight. Would you prefer we let Ozorn and his allies roll over us?" Dane palmed some cheese. Breaking off a piece, she let her hand drop to hang beside her leg, and offered the tidbit to the creature. Tentacles grabbed the cheese and pulled it into the shadow. Dane offered another morsel. The Darking made that vanish too. "By the way," Sirah told Ganiel, "I think one of your servants might have escaped somehow and wandered here. It called itself a Darking." Dane flinched. The shadow flinched too and slipped off her foot to hide in the darkness under the table. The woman fumbled with her apron, then sighed, exasperated. "Look at this." She lifted her hand. Her fingers stuck out of the hole in her pocket. "It got away." The pale god covered Sirah's pocket with one hand. White light shimmered, and an image of the Darking appeared. Immediately the Dream King shook his head. "He's never seen its like," Weirin told the humans. Ganiel's light faded. He withdrew his hand from Sirah's apron. "I told them you are strict with your subjects," said Queenclaw, grooming her tail. Rising to his feet, Ganiel nodded to them all and vanished. "He's terrible at goodbyes," remarked Broadfoot. "Worse than a cat that way." "I prefer to think he's as good as a cat," retorted Queenclaw. Sirah got to her feet. "Well, no amount of wondering and chatter will see that the dishes are done. Let's get started, Dane." The girl looked up at her mother, surprised. It had been a long time since anyone had told her to assist with cleanup. She wanted to say that she was tired, but if she did, her mother would fuss, and no doubt feed her nasty-tasting potions. With a sigh, the girl rose. Accepting a stack of plates from Sirah, she bore them inside. A washtub sat on a table in the common room, steaming faintly. Dane set her burden next to it and turned. Sirah blocked the garden door, a bottle in one hand, a cup in the other. The girl winced. So much for fooling her ma. "You overdid today, and you know it." She poured dark liquid into the cup. "Drink this, and off to bed with you." Dane took the cup, but didn't drink. "Ma, why am I so weak? Are you sure it's because I'm half mortal, or might it be something worse?" Sirah shook her golden head. "You came here long before it was time," she said firmly. "The balance between your mortal and divine blood is delicate. A crossing like yours usually causes problems. They're only temporary, I promise you. Now drink, miss." It tasted as vile as she had feared. She kissed her mother's cheek, went into her room, and closed the door. A dull hiss filled Dane's ears. Darkness covered her eyes. Light dawned far ahead. It was impossible to tell if the scene she now saw moved toward her, or if she flew to it. Within moments she was close enough to see two-leggers standing in a ring, arms overlapping, hands clasping their neighbors' shoulders. In the middle of their circle, a lump of material shifted and pulsed in the same colors as the chaos vent had done. Dane turned her face away. "It's all right." Rattail appeared beside her. "You can look. You must look." Dane obeyed. At first the ring of men and women, and the thing at the hub, stood on black, empty space. One by one, stars winked into being around them. With the added light, she could see the faces of those who formed the circle. Their names sprang into her mind as if she had always known their true appearance. The black god in his deep cowl and long robe, the great mother goddess. Dane identified Kadunka, the world snake, lord of the Banchiku tribes, and even the Chimeri gods of storm and fire. The large, powerful-looking black man in gold armor was Mythos himself. Looking from face to face, she saw that all the great gods but one formed the ring. The lump in their center began to rise, changing color swiftly. When it halted, a person stood there, bent nearly double. The hunched figure straightened. At first it was a gold-skinned woman with stormy gray hair and a simple gray dress. Within a breath she changed. Her skin went yellow, her hair became twigs, her body sprouted a mass of tentacles. That, too, lasted briefly. She never kept one shape for long, but shifted constantly from patchwork to patchwork, in combinations of things that lived and things that did not. Pincers grew on a cheater's forequarters, a cow's head and a man's legs were attached. Just to look at the changing thing made Dane's stomach roll. The creature lurched to one side, diving for the opening between the Wavewalker and the Black God. White fire appeared to form a dome between gods and their captive. Half lion, half crone, she dropped and crawled for the gap between the thief and the smith, only to retreat howling after she touched the barrier. "Why don't they kill her?" Dane asked. "They just wear themselves out holding her in their circle, and she doesn't seem to weaken at all. They are forbidden to, as she is forbidden to slay them, Rat-Tail explained. They can imprison and enslave each other, but Father Universe and Mother Flame, who made them all, will not let their children murder a sibling. The scene rippled like pond water and dissolved before her. Dane was flying backward now, over a broad, perfectly flat plain. Looking around, wondering what had happened to the circle and the shifting monster, she discovered a lone figure, Ganiel. A gale whipped his shirt and breeches. He reached one hand out to her. A balance hung from his white fingers. A crack opened under the Dream King's feet. His left foot rested on that flat and barren floor. His right was planted to the ankle in gray-green muck that boiled and twisted. Ganiel vanished when Dane opened her eyes. I have such peculiar dreams here, she complained to the ceiling. Seemingly the Dream King wants me to know something, but why? Given my druthers, I'd rather have a good sleep. She sighed and rolled out of bed, to hit the floor with a bang. The floor was comfortingly solid. Her old strength was returning faster than it had the day before. She tried to puzzle out the rest of her dream as she made her bed, cleaned her face and teeth, and brushed a multitude of tangles out of her hair. At least she felt like her old self for the first time in days, even if she couldn't decide what Ganiel meant. The items in her room had been added to during the night. She found boots and a belt. On a chair lay neat stacks of folded breeches, shirts, loincloths, stockings, and breastbands, all in her favorite colors. Unlike her dream, Dane could read Sirrah's message easily. Her mother had provided as if Dane would spend the rest of her life here. She would not be happy when Dane insisted upon leaving. Dane needed to clear her head to prepare a campaign against her parents. Putting on yesterday's dress, she gathered clean garments, towels, and brush, and went into the main room. Broadfoot was there, nibbling a bunch of grapes on the counter. Is there a place I can swim? She asked. My head feels like mush. The Duckmole's eyes lit. There's the pond where I stay when I am here, he replied eagerly. It's clean and quiet, and not too far. Come on. Dane followed. After a few minutes' walk along a forest trail, they reached a very broad pond, almost a small lake, set just below a ridge crowned with brambles. Her guide plunged in as soon as they reached the water. Finding a cluster of broad, flat-topped rocks on the pond's rim, Dane put her things on them and began to strip off her clothes. The Duckmole surfaced, a frog sticking out of his bill, and swallowed his meal. Hurry up, he urged. Dane wondered if the meal that he'd just eaten was a god, too. Would it be reborn, as their father claimed the hare had been? As if to answer her, a small frog, identical to the one that Broadfoot had just eaten, rocketed out of the water to land on the Duckmole's head. It gave a rasping trill, then leaped on the path and out of sight as Dane giggled and the Duckmole glared. Some gods always have to comment when they're being eaten, he grumbled, and dove once more. Wearing only a loincloth and breastband, Dane slipped into the water. It was cold, drawn from mountain streams. She yelped with the first shock, then took a deep breath and submerged. Long experience had taught her to keep moving until she warmed up. Opening her eyes, she could see most of the area around her. The water was crystal clear. Broadfoot swam up and ran his bill over her face. His eyes were closed. Spinning, he sank to the bottom and glided snake-like over it, passing his bill over everything in his path. Soon he was gone from sight, questing for prey. The gods of bass, minnows, sticklebacks, and brook trout fled Dane's approach, then returned in small groups to nose her. She squirmed, they tickled, and dropped to the bottom. There she sat, looking around as the fish continued to examine her. A snapping turtle, bigger than those she knew in the mortal realms, eased out of the mud and glided over. Dane watched him uncertainly, not liking the idea of those formidable jaws closing on any part of her. Instead, the turtle circled her twice, inspecting, then swam away. Thrusting herself to the surface, she filled her lungs with fresh air, then submerged again. A black, inky blob rose to meet her as she swam farther out. She stopped, treading water. Before her, the blot spread until it was plate-sized. Gently she reached out and touched it. Was it a Darking? She felt warmth and a slippery resistance. Against the Darking's blackness, a face she knew far too well appeared. Osborne the Stormwing, once called the Emperor Mage. He was perched on a wooden fence above her, staring into the distance. Suddenly he looked down. He seemed to be staring directly at her. His mouth stretched in a savage grin. Throwing his head back, he voiced a screeching call that she heard even underwater. Gasping her shock, the girl choked as the pond filled her mouth and throat. With a kick, she drove herself to the surface, trying not to breathe more water before she got there. She broke into the air, liquid pouring from her mouth and nose. Was that another Darking? Or the one from yesterday? She wondered, treading water and coughing. And how could a Darking show her a vision of Ozorn? How... A low grating hum filled her magical hearing. It was faint to begin with, but swiftly turned into a roar. Frantic, she looked around for the source. Only an immortal could affect her magic like this. The sound was new, which meant she'd never met this kind of immortal. She hated that. She hated surprises in general. Her things lay on rocks on the beach of an inlet that opened onto the rest of the pond. On the far side of the inlet, air bent and rippled. From its warping center came a reddish-brown arm with a black-nailed hand, and a powerful, shaggy leg tipped with a splayed hoof. Dane caught her breath as the owner of the arm and leg finished his crossing between the mortal and divine realms. It was a Taurus. Her skin crept. She had seen drawings and heard tales, but they had never frightened her as much as looking at one did now. The immortal was 7 feet tall, with short, strong horns. He had a bull's broad, powerful neck and slab-like shoulders, but the large eyes pointed forward like a predator's. His nose was almost human, but squared off and flat. The jaws were large, the teeth nearly too wide for them. Most of the remainder was human, though built on a large, powerful scale to support his massive head. Since he wore nothing like clothes, she could see that he was quite definitely male. As he turned to one side, she glimpsed a bull's tail at the foot of his ridged spine. She held very still, treading water lightly. The stories claimed their sight was poor. Smell was the thing to worry about with a Taurus. Could it smell her? The creature swayed, eyes shut, nose lifted. He snuffled wetly. If he catches me, he'll rape me, she thought, scalp prickling. The stories were far too detailed about the fate of women who met these particular immortals. Quietly, without lifting her arms or feet from the water, she thrust herself to shore, mind fixed on her clothes. She always left her bow with them when she swam. Then she remembered, her strength evaporating. She had no weapon. Her bows were in the mortal realms. She heard a bone-rattling bellow and looked back. The Taurus had her scent. It was wading into the pond. The need for quiet was over. Making for the rock, she swam in long practiced strokes. She had a head start on the thing. She'd outrun it to her maws. Too busy watching the Taurus to see where she was going, she plowed into the mud at the water's edge. Gasping, she lurched to her feet and ran the few steps to her clothes and towels, grabbing them. The immortal was a third of the way across the inlet. He was an ungainly swimmer, wallowing like a bull, but wise enough to use his arms to pull himself through the water. She turned and ran 3 steps, then halted. If she escaped, he would find her mother. Nearly 4 years of protecting others from immortals, fused with a lifetime of looking after Syrah. Wiryn was forgotten. Her frightened mind seized on one thing. If he didn't get her, the Taurus would go after her maw. The Taurus bellowed. Dane spun. She had to do something. In a minute he would be on her. Hands shaking, she dropped what she held. If only she had a bow. Even the sling she'd used as a girl. The towels lay across her fallen clothes in a pair of clean white stripes. She grabbed both, slinging one over her shoulder, keeping the other in hand. The brambles grew to the pond's edge on her left. Even if she had seen ammunition there, it would be impossible to get. She'd have to go to her right, around the open edge of the water. Trotting around the cluster of rocks where she'd left her things, she scanned the ground. In a heap of stones and gravel, she saw 5 rocks the size of hen's eggs. The Taurus moaned, a sound that made her own throat go tight. He was 2/3 of the way across the neck of water between them. Dane seized a rock. Fumbling slightly, it had been years since she'd used a sling. She folded the towel into a sling and placed the stone in the cradle. Cloth and rock felt awkward, even wrong, as she began to twirl her makeshift weapon. Her body protested the large, strong movements required for a sling. When she felt the best moment, when the weight of the stone and the speed of her arm seemed right, she released one end of the sling. The rock shot past the immortal's head, skipped over the surface, then dropped from sight. The Taurus watched her missile sink. Horrified, Dane could see that he stood on the bottom. The water was up to his chest. When I was little, I would have been glad to skip a rock 4 times, she thought, grabbing a new stone. She neatened the towel sling, keeping an eye on the Taurus. He decided that her first missile was not worth his interest. He plowed into the shallows, drooling as he stared at her. "Goddess, help me," she whispered. Bringing the sling up higher, she twirled hard. The motion felt better. She let fly. It struck the Taurus on the shoulder, opening a large gash. He roared with pain and fury. Silvery blood coursed over his chest. Frantically, he scooped pond water to splash on the wound, flat nose running. Dane seized 2 more stones, all she could hold, and backed up, putting the cluster of flat rocks between her and the immortal. It was hard to neaten the sling one-handed. Still retreating, she took the time to do it right. Sloppy work now would kill her. When the Taurus advanced, she loaded a rock and began to twirl. The circles of her wrist and elbow were broad now. Her sense of when to release was exact. She let fly. Her stone hit the Taurus in the throat. His bellow was a strangled croak. He dropped to his knees with a splash, scrabbling at his neck. Dripping sweat, the girl flipped her sling into place and loaded her final rock. The Taurus lurched to his feet, wheezing. He stumbled forward, flat teeth bared. "Don't!" she called, lips quivering. She didn't want to kill a beast who could no more help his nature than she could. "Give up, please!" He roared and came on, the ground quivering under his weight. When he was 6 yards from her, she loosed her final shot with all her strength. It slammed between his eyes and stayed, embedded in his skull. The Taurus gasped, flailed blindly, and toppled into the mud. There he thrashed, and choked, and died. "I'm sorry," she cried, eyes overflowing. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Broadfoot surfaced nearby, plainly upset. "What happened? If I'd known that a Taurus was about, I wouldn't have brought you here. Where did it come from?" "It crossed between realms," she replied, still trembling. "I think it may have been sent. I had a vision of Ozorn anyway, right before it came." "But how did he know where you are?" "I've no idea." "And why do you weep? You've killed before." "And I hate it," she cried, "especially when this poor idiot thing couldn't do no different." She tried to gather her things and dump them into the mud. "Look at him! What else is he made for but to prey on females? Are there any lady Tauruses?" No, there aren't." "Wonderful. No one cared enough to give them mates of their own kind. All they know to do is grab two-legger females. They either kill them or get themselves killed. It's wrong." Pulling her belongings from the mud, she ran to her parents' house. Broadfoot eyed the dead Taurus. "She has a point," he told it. "Someone ought to bring the matter to the great god's attention once things quiet down a bit." Halfway to her parents' home, the girl paused. A Stormwing awaited her there. She hesitated only for a moment, then reformed her towel sling and grabbed stones for ammunition. If that Stormwing was an enemy, he or she had a surprise coming. Emerging from the cover of the tree, she saw that her father and Numer were seated on the slab of rock that served the cottage as a doorstep. The immortal she had detected stood on the ground before them. He turned as she approached, his movement setting the bones that were braided into his long blonde hair to clicking. Dane relaxed and tossed her rocks aside. She wouldn't need them for Rakosh Moonsword. "What happened to you?" asked the green-eyed Stormwing as Broadfoot appeared on the path between him and the men. Numer got to his feet, frowning. "Broadfoot will explain," Dane said, weaving between the mage and her father. "I need to clean up." She scrubbed, then pulled on clean garments with hands that still trembled. As she was combing out her hair, Sirah knocked on the door. "We're having lunch in the garden," she called. "If you're decent, come take a perch out for your Stormwing friend to sit on." Quickly the girl finished. Feeling calmer now, she did as she was told. Once she'd set up the perch by the outdoor table, Rakosh glided down from the rooftop and took his place. For the moment they were alone. Numer and Wirren were nowhere in sight. "You let me down," the girl told the Stormwing. "We thought your Queen Barza would finish Ozorn once he was a Stormwing. Instead, he shows up in the spring with our enemies and hundreds of Stormwings at his back." 248 Stormwings to be exact, Rakosh said bitterly. Those who did not care that he held the Queen and her mate captive. Those who ignore the fact that he took his Stormwing crown by killing Jakun from behind. Those without regard for Stormwing law. They are the army that followed him to the mortal realms. He laughed. "Queen Barza and her followers are fugitives, Dane. We stayed in the Divine Realms when the barriers fell. Here, at least, we are partly safe from Ozorn and his flock." Ignoring his pronounced odor, Dane put a comforting hand on the Stormwing's shoulder. "I'm sorry to hear it. How are Queen Barza and Lord Hebek?" "Tired," replied the immortal. "As am I. Ozorn sends groups back to harry us. It is not enough to have most of us as followers. Those who will not follow, he wants dead." "How many are on your side of it?" Rakosh shook his head, making the bones in his hair clatter. 63 in all. He tried to smile. It was half bitter. "Don't take us to task for not killing him. We've tried our best. Dane sighed. We humans haven't done so well at it ourselves. Sirrah, Wirren, and Newmar came out, carrying their lunch, as the three animal gods materialized at their places by the table. With Akash positioned downwind so that his odor wouldn't spoil their meal, the plates and bowls were passed. Has anyone thought of a way that we can go home? Asked Newmar. There is none, growled Wirren. The great gods are speaking to no one as long as Usei fights them. Dane moved the food on her plate. What about the animal gods? I came here last fall while I was in Karthik. You took me back to the mortal realms then, Badger. Not possible, replied the great animal. You were dead then. All I had to do was put you back into your mortal body. With both of you still alive, not all the animal gods together could move you between the realms. You are far better off here with your mother, said Wirren. If you insist on leaving, then wait until the fall equinox, when the gates open for the likes of us and you. And there's one of those things again, he cried as the darking oozed onto the table, having climbed up Dane's leg. Leave it be, Dad, she told him. It's not hurting anyone. Stretching to make itself taller, the darking changed. Up came a serpent-like neck, supporting a wedge-shaped head. The body the darking made was long and slender, with powerful hindquarters and long forepaws that were as nimble as hands. 2 great wings unfurled out of the blot shoulders. Dragons, Akash said. This creature is right, whatever it is. They might very well take you back. You have been looking after their young one. You mean for my daughter to journey to the Dragonlands? Absolutely not, Wirren snapped. It's too risky. They might refuse to help, Queenclaw pointed out. I never met a dragon that wasn't perverse. They're worse than we cats. Even the great gods can't force a dragon to do anything it doesn't wish to. I'm almost positive they will do it, said Akash, baiting. Don't forget, we Stormwings know them best. Our eyries border on the Dragonlands. They are proud. 1 or 2 of Skysong's kin will feel they must repay you for what you've done, and 1 is all you need to go home. He looked at Newmar and grinned. Well, it may take 2. There's so much extra of one of you. The girl smiled, then asked, How do we find them? The Stormwing looked at Wirren. I'm sure a map can be drawn, unless you plan to cage them. Ma, please listen, pleaded Dane. Humans and people need us. I've friends that would risk their lives for me and Newmar. If you won't help us, then we'll muddle along on our own, but we can't just sit here, seeing them in visions, and laze about. The god sighed and rubbed his antlers. No, I won't cage them. Sirrah wiped her eyes. Not even a day I've had to talk to you, but I know you can't sit idly by when them you care for are in trouble. Lord Akash, the house cat said, they will need help to cross the sea of sand. The immortal sidled, digging into his perch with steel claws. I will see what can be done. It will take persuasion. He looked from Dane to Newmar, frowning. Be careful, he told them. The divine realms are perilous. Maybe Queen Barza is right, and I am getting sentimental, but I would hate to see anything happen to either of you. Jumping into the air, he took flight, blowing waves of stench over the table.